After warning Vladimir Putin may use chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine, tonight President Biden at an emergency NATO summit declaring the U.S. will take action if there's a chemical attack.
We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
But when pressed, still no specifics on whether military force is on the table.
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
The president saying this summit with leaders of NATO, the G7 and the EU is sending an unmistakable message to Putin.
He didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have.
Mr. Biden and NATO announcing new penalties against Russia, including new sanctions on Russian lawmakers and $1 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine. That money a part of recently approved funds. But Ukraine's President Zelensky, speaking by video to the summit, was sharply critical of the U.S. and NATO for not doing more, saying Ukrainians are dying and NATO, quote, has yet to show what it can do to save people, pleading for tanks, fighter jets, and a no-fly zone. Zelensky saying Ukraine is waiting for real actions. Meanwhile, Mr. Biden saying he will push for Russia to be removed from the group of major economies known as the G20, and that so far China, which like much of Europe still buys Russian oil and gas, has not given Russia more military aid.
China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged.
So far, the U.S. and NATO allies have unleashed significant sanctions against Russia for the invasion. But those penalties have not deterred Putin, something the White House and Vice President Harris initially said was the goal.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
But today, the president bristling when asked if that strategy was not working.
I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, that's what will stop him.
And Kristen joining me here in Brussels right now. The president heading to Poland tomorrow. That, of course, the epicenter of the refugee crisis.
That's right, Lester. In fact, President Biden hinted he may meet with refugees while he's in Poland. And it comes as the U.S. announced today it will take in up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.